The fake eviction notice crackled in my hands as I realized Brenda Kessler had just stepped into a trap she didn't even know existed. 6 a.m., this psychotic HOA president slides bogus court documents under my door like some criminal genius. Paper still warm from her printer, reeking of fresh toner and desperation. Misspelled legal terms, fake signatures, made-up case numbers, amateur hour at its finest. For months, Brenda had been hunting my Hispanic family with racist harassment. Every bogus violation, every invented fine, all building to this moment of actual document fraud. Last week, she'd screamed,
"People like you don't belong here, and I'll do whatever it takes to remove you."
What made my blood sing with anticipation. Brenda had absolutely no clue who she was really targeting. My neighbors think my wife Sarah just has some boring government desk job. They have no idea she's about to become Brenda's worst nightmare. What would you do if your HOA Karen tried to forge you out of your home? Drop your location below. Let me back up and tell you how we got here, because this story is too good to rush. My name is Henry Rivera, and 3 years ago, my wife Sarah and I thought we'd found paradise in Sunset Ridge, a quiet subdivision outside Phoenix. After 20 years as a master electrician, a herniated disc forced me into early semi-retirement. We used our life savings to buy a modest ranch home where I could start a small solar installation business without the heavy lifting. The neighborhood was perfect. 147 homes built in the late 90s, filled with retirees who actually waved and young families whose kids played street hockey until sunset. The smell of mesquite barbecue and chlorinated pool water drifted through desert evenings that felt like freedom itself. HOA fees were reasonable at $180 monthly, and the previous board focused on actual maintenance instead of power trips. Sarah loved the quiet anonymity. What our neighbors didn't know was that my wife's boring government job meant presiding over federal cases in the U.S. District Court for Arizona. She deliberately stayed vague, telling people she worked downtown at the courthouse because judges need privacy. After dealing with million-dollar fraud cases and constitutional law all day, she craved being just Sarah the neighbor, not Judge Rivera. The texture of our evening walks, soft asphalt still radiating heat, the distant sound of sprinklers clicking across lawns, felt like peace after years of Phoenix traffic and construction sites. For 2 blissful years, it worked perfectly. Then Brenda Kessler invaded our paradise. Brenda was 52, recently divorced from some tech executive, and had relocated from an exclusive California suburb where HOAs apparently operated like miniature police states. She drove a pristine white Lexus that gleamed like a weapon, and never appeared without perfect makeup that probably cost more than my monthly groceries. Here's the thing about desperate people with too much time and too little purpose. They always find something to control. Within weeks, Brenda had convinced our aging board members to elect her president by promising to restore property values through enhanced community standards. The way she said enhanced made it sound like she was planning military occupation rather than neighborhood management. Her first board meeting lasted 4 hours. 4 hours. The poor secretary's hand cramped from taking notes as Brenda dissected every bylaw with surgical precision. The crunch of her designer heels on gravel became our neighborhood's new soundtrack as she prowled streets with a clipboard, hunting violations like some suburban predator. But here's what caught my attention. Brenda immediately targeted exactly 3 families for citations. The Lucys, who'd lived here 8 years without a single complaint. The Patels, whose only crime was hosting joyful family gatherings that involved, gasp, more than 6 cars. And us, the Riveras, who apparently committed treason by owning a work truck. Week 2 of the Brenda regime, I found her calling card under my windshield wiper. Unauthorized commercial vehicle display, $75 fine, 10-day appeal period. The paper had that crisp official weight that screamed someone was taking themselves way too seriously. That night, I spread the HOA bylaws across our kitchen table like battle plans, reading every microscopic word twice. Nowhere, absolutely nowhere, did it mention restrictions on commercial vehicles in your own driveway. When I called Brenda to discuss this misunderstanding, her response froze my blood. "Mr. Rivera," she purred with false sweetness, "the board interprets community standards as needed to maintain our neighborhood's character. If you have concerns, you're welcome to attend our monthly meetings." The emphasis on our neighborhood hit like a slap. This wasn't about trucks or bylaws. This was about power, territory, and keeping certain people in their designated places. Sarah found me grumbling while installing solar panels that evening, muttering creative curse words in both English and Spanish. "What exactly did she say?" she asked, and something sharp in her voice made me pause. "Just typical power-drunk nonsense," I replied, not realizing I'd just described federal civil rights violations to a federal judge. Over the next week, Sarah asked increasingly specific questions about HOA procedures, election processes, and oversight requirements. I should have recognized that analytical intensity, the same focus she brought to complex federal cases. But I was too angry to realize Brenda had just declared war on the wrong family. Brenda didn't waste time escalating her little war. 2 weeks after the truck citation, I woke up to another piece of paper tucked under my doormat like a passive-aggressive love note. This time, it was a lawn height violation, $150 fine plus $50 re-inspection fee. According to Brenda's professional measurement, my grass was 2.75 inches tall, exceeding the community standard of 2.5 inches. Wait, let me repeat that. 2 3/4 inches. She was fining me for grass that was a 1/4 inch too tall. I stood there in my boxers, morning coffee growing cold in my shaking hands, staring at this woman's insanity documented in official letterhead. The citation included time-stamped photos and claimed she'd used a calibrated measuring device to ensure accuracy. The paper still smelled faintly of her printer ink and what I could only describe as the scent of someone who'd lost their damn mind. Because apparently Brenda Kessler owned a grass ruler and the free time to crawl around my lawn measuring individual blades like some suburban forensic scientist. But here's where my construction background came in handy. 20 years of dealing with building inspectors had taught me that when someone throws bogus technical claims at you, you counter with real professionals. I called Rodriguez Landscaping, the same company that maintained half the neighborhood lawns, and hired them for an independent measurement. Carlos Rodriguez showed up the next day with equipment that made Brenda's calibrated device look like a toy. After 20 years cutting grass in Phoenix, he took one look at her photos and started chuckling. The sound of his measuring tape snapping against concrete echoed across my yard as he worked. "Senor Rivera," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "She measured during drought stress. When grass is thirsty, it compresses naturally. Your lawn was actually 2 inches when she measured it, well within any reasonable standard." The smell of freshly cut grass and morning sprinkler mist filled the air as Carlos explained how professional lawn measurement actually works. You measure in 3 spots, at optimal hydration, with grass standing naturally. Brenda had cherry-picked the tallest blade after deliberately overwatering her test area to make the grass stand taller. That's when I remembered something from my electrical licensing days. You always research the rules before challenging authority. Spent the next evening diving into Arizona HOA regulations, and that's when I discovered something beautiful hidden in the bureaucratic fine print. State law requires all HOA board elections to be certified with the county clerk within 30 days of the vote. It's one of those oversight requirements most people ignore, but it's absolutely mandatory. Invalid boards can't legally collect fines or enforce rules. As I scrolled through public records that night, guess whose paperwork was mysteriously missing? That's right. Brenda Kessler had never properly filed her election certification. Technically, her entire presidency was legally questionable. I was documenting everything now, photos, timestamps, audio recordings of our conversations. Sarah had casually mentioned that her courthouse job had taught her the importance of keeping detailed records, suggesting I treat this like building a case that might someday matter in ways I couldn't imagine. Smart woman, my wife. If only I'd known how smart. The pattern became clearer when Mrs. Lucy knocked on our door one evening, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by obvious distress. The distant sound of her family's dinner preparation, sizzling garlic, steaming rice, the gentle clatter of chopsticks drifted from her kitchen windows. "Henry, did you get citations too? Brenda says our cooking smells are culturally inappropriate for the neighborhood standards." I felt my blood pressure spike. The aroma of the Lucy's authentic Chinese cooking had always been one of my favorite parts of evening walks. Now, apparently, stir-fry constituted a community violation. "She's targeting all of us," I told Mrs. Lucy, inviting her in. "The Hispanic family, the Asian family, the Indian family. Notice a pattern?" Over the next week, I organized informal coffee meetings with the Patels and Lucys. We compared citations and discovered the discrimination was even more systematic than I'd suspected. Mr. Patel, who worked as an accountant, had maintained meticulous records with the precision of someone who understood numbers don't lie. 43 citations in 6 months, he said, spreading papers across our kitchen table. 39 went to minority families. The 4 white families who got cited, all for serious violations like oil stains or broken fences. We get cited for cooking food and having the wrong skin color. The weight of calculated harassment settled over our meeting like desert dust after a storm. This wasn't random crazy behavior. This was deliberate, systematic discrimination designed to terrorize specific families into leaving. But then came the mini twist that changed everything. That Friday, Brenda called an emergency board meeting to discuss my escalating aggressive behavior and documented threats to community harmony. Apparently, questioning her authority with facts and professional measurements constituted domestic terrorism in her twisted worldview. The meeting notice arrived with a beautiful irony. She scheduled it for the same night as the monthly federal court administration meeting that Sarah attended downtown. Perfect timing for what would become the most important coincidence of this entire saga. The emergency board meeting was a masterclass in petty tyranny disguised as community concern. Brenda had transformed the clubhouse into her personal courtroom, complete with a folding table positioned like a judge's bench and name placards for the 3 board members who'd apparently agreed to this charade. The smell of stale coffee mixed with her overpowering perfume, something expensive and cloying that reminded me of funeral flowers. She'd also stacked the deck, inviting only her supporters while forgetting to notify the families she'd been targeting. Lucky for me, Mrs. Lucy had overheard the Peterson woman gossiping about it at the mailboxes and rallied the troops. "Ladies and gentlemen," Brenda began, her voice carrying the false authority of someone who'd binged legal dramas all weekend. "We're here to address Mr. Rivera's pattern of hostile behavior toward legitimate community enforcement." The way she emphasized legitimate while waving my professional lawn measurement report made my jaw clench. But 20 years of dealing with power-drunk inspectors had taught me the golden rule. Stay calm, stick to facts, let them destroy themselves with their own words. "I brought documentation for everyone," I said, distributing copies of the actual HOA bylaws alongside Rodriguez Landscaping's professional assessment. The paper felt crisp and official, real authority versus Brenda's manufactured drama. "Can you show me exactly where commercial vehicles are prohibited in private driveways?" Brenda's perfectly applied crimson lipstick compressed into a thin line of barely contained rage. "Mr. Rivera, the board interprets community standards based on the spirit of our covenant, not just literal wording." "The spirit?" I kept my voice level despite wanting to burst out laughing. "So you're enforcing rules that don't actually exist based on feelings?" That's when Harold Lucy, the elderly board treasurer who'd clearly been pressured into this meeting, found his backbone with the shaky voice of someone who'd finally reached his limit. "Brenda, I've read these bylaws 4 times now. There's absolutely nothing about trucks, lawn measurements, or cooking smells." The sound of papers rustling filled the uncomfortable silence as other attendees actually examined the documents I'd provided instead of just accepting Brenda's word as gospel. You could practically hear the collective realization that they'd been fed complete garbage for months, but desperate dictators never surrender gracefully. Brenda pulled out a manila folder with the theatrical flair of a prosecutor presenting murder evidence, her hands trembling slightly with suppressed fury. "Mr. Rivera has been conducting illegal surveillance on board members and encouraging frivolous complaints with county authorities to undermine legitimate community governance." "Surveillance?" The laugh escaped before I could stop it. "You mean the security cameras I installed on my own property after you started your harassment campaign?" "And those complaints aren't frivolous," Mrs. Lucy announced from the doorway, where she'd arrived with the cavalry, the Patels, Gonzalez family, and 3 other targeted households. "We verified with the county clerk. HOA board elections must be properly certified within 30 days of the vote." The silence that followed could have been measured with scientific instruments. Brenda's face cycled through a fascinating color spectrum from porcelain white to embarrassed pink to furious crimson as the implications hit her. "That's just a bureaucratic technicality," she stammered, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Technicalities matter in legal proceedings," Mr. Patel said with an accountant's deadly precision. "Uncertified boards lack legal authority to collect fines or enforce regulations. We researched thoroughly. Here's what I learned about cornered narcissists that night. They always escalate rather than retreat. Instead of admitting error or stepping back, Brenda's voice rose to a pitch that could have summoned neighborhood dogs. Fine. You people want to play legal games? I'll take this straight to federal court if necessary. This community has standards, and I'll use every legal resource available to maintain them properly. The phrase "you people" dropped into the room like a racial slur wrapped in a bow. Even her supporters shifted uncomfortably, finally hearing the bigotry they'd been pretending didn't exist. But what made my blood sing was Brenda's federal court threat. She was so blinded by rage and desperation that she'd just escalated from petty HOA harassment into federal jurisdiction territory. The beautiful irony made me want to text Sarah immediately. That evening, my wife displayed unusual curiosity about the meeting specifics. She asked detailed questions about Brenda's exact phrasing, particularly the federal court threat, while systematically organizing all my documentation with the methodical precision of someone building a legal case. "She actually said federal court?" Sarah asked, her tone carrying undertones I couldn't quite identify. "Those exact words. Why? Is that significant?" Sarah studied Brenda's citation paperwork for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Federal courts handle civil rights violations and housing discrimination cases. If she keeps escalating toward actual legal action..." The sentence hung unfinished, but the implication was clear. Brenda was stumbling toward serious federal territory, the kind that ruins lives instead of just weekends. The devastating mini twist arrived 3 days later via certified mail. Brenda's ultimatum to all non-compliant residents demanding adherence to her enhanced standards within 30 days, or face federal legal consequences including eviction proceedings through appropriate court channels. She'd just threatened federal action, claimed invalid authority, and promised eviction based on imaginary rules. The woman was systematically building a federal case against herself, one threatening document at a time. Brenda's certified letter threats triggered something she didn't expect: organized resistance. Within hours of those intimidating ultimatums hitting mailboxes, my phone rang nonstop. The Lucys, Patels, Gonzalez family. Even white neighbors who'd finally realized they might be next on Brenda's ethnic cleansing list. Everyone wanted the same answer. Could she actually evict us for cooking ethnic food? The answer was obviously hell no, but fear makes people irrational. Exactly what Brenda counted on to maintain her suburban dictatorship. That weekend, I organized a concerned homeowners meeting in our backyard. The aroma of Sarah's grilled corn mixed with cooling desert air as 18 families gathered around borrowed picnic tables, sharing horror stories that revealed systematic persecution disguised as community standards. She cited me for excessive cultural displays during my daughter's quinceañera, Maria Gonzalez said, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. Claimed the papel picado decorations violated visual harmony standards that don't exist anywhere in our bylaws. The sound of rustling papers filled the evening air as families compared citations. Mrs. Patel had been fined for aromatic violations during Diwali celebrations. Elderly Mr. Kim received warnings about his grandson's foreign language noise pollution in their own backyard. The Lucys got cited for unauthorized food preparation odors every time they cooked authentic Chinese meals. Meanwhile, Brenda's white neighbors hosted parties until 2 a.m., parked RVs blocking sidewalks, and maintained dead brown lawns without receiving a single violation notice. The discrimination wasn't subtle, it was documented, systematic, and completely illegal. I brought copies of actual HOA rules for everyone, I announced, distributing real bylaws alongside civil rights summaries that Sarah had mysteriously produced from her government office. Compare these to Brenda's invented violations. The collective realization was audible: gasps, muttered curses in multiple languages, and the distinctive sound of people discovering they'd been systematically scammed. Roughly 90% of Brenda's citations violated no actual community rules. She'd been manufacturing authority from pure bigotry, but Mr. Patel's bombshell revelation made everyone's blood run cold. "I analyzed 6 months of financial records," he said, spreading spreadsheets across our patio table with an accountant's deadly precision. "Brenda has collected $4,800 in completely illegal fines while diverting required maintenance funds to a personal account she controls." The desert evening suddenly felt 20 degrees colder. "Personal account?" I asked. "She's not just discriminating," Mr. Patel continued, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who understood numbers don't lie. She's embezzling community money while doing it. This isn't harassment anymore. It's federal fraud. The weight of that realization settled over our gathering like a thunderstorm. Brenda had escalated from racist HOA enforcement to actual federal crimes, stealing money while destroying lives. That's when Janet Peterson arrived, looking like she'd seen a ghost. Janet had been one of Brenda's original supporters, the kind of neighbor who believed authority figures deserved automatic respect. But she stumbled toward our group with the shaky steps of someone whose worldview had just imploded. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Brenda called me today about final solutions for problematic residents. She wanted to know if the community would support legal action to permanently remove certain families." The phrase "final solutions" hit like a physical blow. Even in Arizona heat, I felt goosebumps crawl up my arms. "What kind of legal action?" Mrs. Lucy asked, though we all suspected the answer. "Eviction proceedings through federal court," Janet continued, her words tumbling out like a confession. "She's been researching federal housing law, claims she can build cases that will hold up under federal scrutiny. She mentioned something about finding the right judge who would understand community standards. The irony was so perfect it felt like divine intervention. Brenda was planning to take her racist harassment campaign to federal court, specifically targeting the jurisdiction where my wife served as a federal judge. The universe apparently had a sense of humor. But the truly devastating mini-twist came when Janet pulled out her phone with trembling hands. "She sent me this text message an hour ago," Janet whispered, showing us Brenda's latest communication. "Have identified optimal federal court strategy. Judge Rivera in district court known for supporting property values over disruptive elements. Will file preliminary eviction papers Monday targeting multiple problem families simultaneously." The blood drained from my face as I read those words. Brenda wasn't just planning federal fraud. She was specifically targeting my wife's court, planning to forge documents in Sarah's name, believing Judge Rivera would support her racist agenda. The woman was about to commit federal crimes against a federal judge's family, using that same judge's name and reputation to justify her actions. That night, Sarah's reaction to this development was unlike anything I'd ever seen. When I showed her Janet's screenshot, my wife went completely still, staring at the phone screen with an expression that could have frozen lava. "She's planning to use my court for housing discrimination," Sarah said quietly, her judge's voice carrying undertones of barely controlled fury. "And she thinks I'll support her." For the first time since this nightmare started, I realized Brenda Kessler had made an enemy who possessed both the authority and the legal knowledge to completely destroy her. That Sunday evening shattered my entire understanding of reality. I came home from installing solar panels at the Johnsons' house, desert dust still coating my work boots, to find Sarah sitting at our kitchen table like she was preparing for war. Every piece of HOA documentation I'd collected over 6 months was spread before her in perfectly organized stacks, color-coded tabs gleaming under our overhead light. Her laptop displayed federal court records, and the air smelled faintly of printer ink from documents I'd never seen before. Something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't Sarah, the supportive wife, anymore. This was a federal judge conducting case analysis with surgical precision. "Henry, sit down." Her voice carried the weight of judicial authority that made my chest tighten. "We need to discuss Brenda Kessler's federal court plans." I settled across from her, noting how my scattered papers had been transformed into a systematic legal brief. The change was unsettling, like discovering your spouse had been secretly building nuclear weapons in the garage. "That text message Janet showed you," Sarah continued, pointing to a printed screenshot with clinical detachment. "Brenda specifically mentioned filing papers in Judge Rivera's court, claiming I would support her property standards agenda." Yeah, the irony is unbelievable. She has no clue you're actually... Henry. The interruption cut like a blade. "I am Judge Rivera." Those 4 words hung between us like a detonated bomb. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too bright, too normal for the magnitude of what she'd just revealed. Of course she was Judge Rivera, Sarah Rivera, federal district judge for the District of Arizona. But somehow, through months of anger and documentation and community organizing, I'd never connected my wife's professional identity to Brenda's increasingly specific federal court threats. The realization crashed over me like ice water in desert heat. Jesus Christ, she's planning to forge documents in your court. It's catastrophically worse, Sarah said, opening a manila folder that materialized like evidence in a criminal trial. I researched our district's random case assignment system today. We have exactly 2 federal judges handling housing cases in this jurisdiction. My hands started trembling as the mathematics became clear. There's a 73% statistical probability that any federal housing case filed in this district gets randomly assigned to my docket, she continued with the ruthless precision of someone calculating prison sentences. The cosmic irony felt like divine intervention. So when Brenda files her fake eviction cases, they come directly to me for judicial review, Sarah finished. She's about to commit federal document fraud in my courtroom, targeting my family, forging my signature, believing I'll support her racist harassment campaign. The silence stretched between us, filled only by the distant hum of our refrigerator and the sound of my worldview completely restructuring itself. But Sarah wasn't finished destroying my assumptions. Everything Brenda has done constitutes federal civil rights violations under the Fair Housing Act, she said, producing another document bearing official federal seals that seemed to glow under our kitchen lights. Discriminatory enforcement, systematic harassment based on national origin, illegal fine collection, it's textbook housing discrimination. The paper felt heavy in my hands, weighted with the authority of federal law. When someone escalates from civil rights violations to document fraud, it becomes federal criminal territory, Sarah explained, her judicial mask slipping to reveal something that looked like barely contained anticipation. Federal fraud carries 5 years per count. Document forgery, impersonating federal officers, mail fraud. She could face decades in federal prison. This wasn't neighborhood drama anymore. This was federal criminal law with life-destroying consequences. What happens now? I whispered. Sarah's expression transformed from judge back to wife, professional composure giving way to something that resembled justice-seeking satisfaction mixed with protective fury. We document everything perfectly and let her commit the crimes, she said with chilling simplicity. I'll recuse myself from family-related cases, obviously, but criminal fraud goes to federal prosecutors who treat document forgery like attempted murder of the justice system itself. Her smile carried the weight of federal authority. Brenda Kessler is about to forge a federal judge's signature in that judge's courthouse while targeting that judge's family. The evidence will be overwhelming, and the consequences permanent. For the first time in months, I felt something approaching peace mixed with anticipation. The next week felt like preparing for the most important performance of my life. Sarah couldn't directly intervene. Judicial ethics required complete separation from any case involving our family. But she could guide me through building an airtight criminal case, ensuring that when Brenda inevitably committed federal fraud, the evidence would be absolutely bulletproof. Think of this like electrical work, Sarah explained over coffee Monday morning, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone walking ethical tightropes. Perfect documentation at every connection point, multiple backup systems, and foolproof safety measures. The analogy clicked immediately. 20 years of wiring houses had taught me that shortcuts electrocute people and sloppy work destroys careers. Building a federal case apparently required the same methodical attention to detail that kept buildings from burning down. First priority, surveillance equipment that would capture everything in courtroom-quality detail. That afternoon at Best Buy, I felt like a kid in a candy store spending $400 on wireless security cameras with 4K resolution and audio recording capabilities. The teenage salesman probably thought I was paranoid about porch pirates, but I was actually preparing to film federal crimes in real time. Installing those cameras was oddly therapeutic, each unit positioned like a perfectly placed electrical outlet, all feeding into a central recording system that backed up automatically to cloud storage. The satisfying snap of each mounting bracket reminded me of connecting circuit breakers, building a network designed to capture every detail when it mattered most. But here's something I learned about home surveillance. Neighbors notice when you suddenly install 6 cameras. Mrs. Peterson from across the street actually called to ask if we'd been robbed. I told her we were just being proactive about security, which technically wasn't lying. The technical preparation was only half our strategy, though. Sarah had carefully suggested I coordinate the affected families into what she diplomatically called a comprehensive record of community interactions. Translation: build an overwhelming mountain of evidence that would make federal prosecutors salivate. Tuesday evening's backyard meeting felt more like a military briefing than a neighborhood gathering. The aroma of Sarah's grilled portobello mushrooms mixed with desert sage as 15 families gathered around our patio table, armed with smartphones, notebooks, and a shared hunger for justice. From this moment forward, every interaction gets recorded, I announced, distributing evidence collection guides that Sarah had mysteriously found online. The paper still smelled like fresh printer toner and legal expertise. Arizona law allows one-party consent recording, which means you can legally document conversations without telling the other person. I remembered my licensing exam days when an instructor taught us that the best electrical systems have redundant safety measures. If one breaker fails, backup systems prevent disasters. That principle applied perfectly here. Mrs. Lucy raised her hand tentatively. What if Brenda tries to fine us for recording her harassment? Let her try, I replied with a grin that felt genuinely predatory. Recording isn't a violation of any actual HOA rule, it's just smart protection against people who abuse authority. We established a shared Google Drive where everyone could upload documentation. Photos, audio recordings, copies of bogus citations, financial evidence of illegal fine collection. Mr. Patel, with his accountant's obsession for systematic organization, volunteered to maintain a master spreadsheet tracking every federal housing law violation. The beauty of our surveillance web was its redundancy. If Brenda targeted one family, 12 others would witness and document it. If she attempted private intimidation, audio recordings would preserve every threatening word. She was walking into a documentation network that would capture her federal crimes in exhaustive detail. Wednesday brought intelligence that made my pulse quicken with anticipation. Janet Peterson called with information that felt like Christmas morning wrapped in justice. Brenda asked me to research federal court filing procedures, she whispered conspiratorially. She wants to know how to submit documents that look professionally prepared for federal judicial review. The woman was literally researching how to commit more convincing fraud. The irony was so perfect it felt orchestrated by cosmic justice. She also mentioned needing help with proper judicial formatting, Janet continued breathlessly. Said she wanted her papers to meet federal court standards so Judge Rivera would take them seriously. I had to bite my tongue to prevent laughing out loud. Brenda was preparing to forge Sarah's signature while trying to impress Sarah with her professionalism. If Shakespeare had written HOA dramas, this would be the climactic irony. By Thursday, our trap was essentially complete. Every family had recording capability, the documentation system was operational, and Brenda was unknowingly building her own federal case with each increasingly desperate threat. But Sarah's final guidance was crucial for the performance ahead. When she serves those fake federal papers, Sarah said during our evening walk, her voice barely audible above the sound of sprinklers clicking across lawns, your reaction must be absolutely perfect. Act shocked, frightened, confused, exactly how innocent people respond to official federal court documents. The desert air carried blooming Palo Verde fragrance as we discussed the psychology of our trap. Brenda needed to believe her federal fraud was successfully terrorizing us into submission. Only complete confidence would drive her to commit the crimes that would destroy her permanently. How much longer? I asked. Sarah's smile was barely visible in twilight shadows. Soon. Desperate people escalate quickly when they smell victory. The trap was set, cameras rolling, evidence systems ready. When Brenda committed federal fraud against our family, we'd deliver it to prosecutors with perfect documentation and a satisfied smile. Brenda's desperation reached its breaking point the following Monday morning at exactly 6:17 a.m. I know the precise time because our security cameras captured everything in crystal clear 4K resolution. Brenda tiptoeing across our front yard like a suburban ninja, sliding an official-looking envelope under our door with the theatrical flair of someone who believed she was delivering a death sentence. The envelope was still warm from her printer when I picked it up, and the chemical smell of fresh toner mixed with what I can only describe as the scent of someone's life about to implode. Inside was the most beautifully incriminating piece of evidence I'd ever seen. Federal District Court for the District of Arizona blazed across the top in bold letters, followed by case number CV-24-01847-SRR. A number that looked official enough to fool most people, but was actually Brenda's birthday followed by Sarah's initials. The document claimed to be signed by the Honorable Sarah Rivera, United States District Judge, complete with an official-looking seal she'd obviously downloaded from the internet. But here's what made this forgery absolutely perfect for our purposes. Brenda hadn't just faked a court document. She'd specifically targeted my wife's court, forged my wife's signature, and claimed my wife had personally ordered our eviction for persistent violations of federal community standards. The irony was so exquisite it felt like divine comedy written by a particularly vengeful god. The fake eviction notice demanded $2,400 in accumulated federal violations and administrative penalties, threatened removal by federal marshals within 72 hours, and included this gem of legal fiction. Judge Rivera has determined that the Rivera family's pattern of community disruption constitutes a federal housing violation requiring immediate residential termination. I had to read that line 3 times before the full absurdity hit me. Brenda had forged a federal judge's signature to order that judge's own family evicted from their home, claiming the judge personally supported ethnic cleansing in her own neighborhood. The woman had achieved a level of cosmic irony that physicists probably couldn't measure. Following Sarah's coaching, I immediately called the federal courthouse to verify this shocking court order. The clerk who answered sounded genuinely confused as she searched their system. "Sir, we show no case filed under that number," she said with professional bewilderment. "And Judge Rivera hasn't issued any residential eviction orders this month. This document doesn't appear in our records." "So it's fake?" I asked, playing the role of terrified homeowner perfectly. "I can't make that determination over the phone, but if someone is forging federal court documents, that's a serious federal crime. You should contact the FBI immediately." The beautiful thing about Brenda's escalation was its systematic thoroughness. She hadn't just committed one federal crime, she'd committed approximately 7. Document forgery, impersonating a federal officer, mail fraud, civil rights violations, and my personal favorite, using the U.S. mail to threaten federal officials, since she'd mailed threats to a federal judge's family. Each offense carried 5 to 20 years in federal prison, and they stacked like building blocks toward life imprisonment. But the mini twist that sealed her fate came 2 hours later, when Mrs. Lucy called in a panic. "Henry, I got the same papers. Brenda says Judge Rivera ordered my family evicted too for cultural violation patterns." Then the Patels called. Then the Gonzalez family. Same fake federal court orders, same forged signature, same impossible legal claims. Brenda had mass-produced federal fraud like she was printing Christmas newsletters, creating a felony count for each family she targeted. By noon, I'd documented 12 identical forgeries, all bearing my wife's forged signature, all claiming my wife supported ethnic cleansing in her own jurisdiction. The evidence was so overwhelming that federal prosecutors would probably fight over who got to prosecute this career-making case. But Brenda wasn't finished destroying her own life. That afternoon, she called an emergency neighborhood meeting to announce her federal court victory and discuss transition procedures for departing residents. The meeting notice, distributed to every house, claimed that Federal District Judge Sarah Rivera has officially validated community enforcement actions and authorized necessary removals. She was doubling down on federal fraud by publicly claiming a federal judge's support for her crimes, creating additional felony counts for each neighbor who received her false statements. The sound of my phone buzzing interrupted my amazed contemplation of Brenda's self-destruction. Sarah was calling from the courthouse. "Henry, I just recused myself from any cases involving our neighborhood," she said, her judicial voice carrying undertones of barely controlled anticipation. "I also had a conversation with the U.S. Attorney's Office about document fraud cases in our district. And they're very interested in people who forge federal judges' signatures. Apparently, it's considered an attack on the federal judiciary itself, which they take more seriously than murder." That evening, as I uploaded our latest evidence to the federal complaint system, I felt like an electrician who'd just completed the most satisfying installation of his career. Every wire was perfectly connected, every safety system operational, every circuit ready to deliver exactly the voltage Brenda deserved. She'd committed enough federal crimes to justify a RICO investigation, and tomorrow's meeting would give her the opportunity to add conspiracy charges to her growing collection. The trap had worked perfectly. Now we just had to let her spring it publicly. Thursday's emergency meeting was Brenda's victory lap, and her funeral march rolled into one spectacular event. She'd transformed this community clubhouse into a celebration of her imagined federal triumph, complete with printed agendas, name tags for departing residents, and a folding table draped with bedsheets to simulate judicial authority. the smell of stale coffee mixed with the metallic scent of her desperation as she prepared to commit federal fraud in front of 90 witnesses. I arrived early, ostensibly to plead for more time, but actually to test our recording equipment one final time. Hidden cameras positioned around the room would capture every word, every gesture, every moment of federal crime in courtroom-quality detail. The sound of chairs scraping against linoleum created an oddly appropriate soundtrack for someone about to destroy their entire existence. Brenda had invited local media, claiming the story of federal court validation for community standards deserved coverage. Channel 12. News sent a junior reporter who looked bored until I casually mentioned that someone might be forging federal court documents. Suddenly, he was very interested in staying for the full show. But the evening's secret guest was the most important attendee. Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Martinez had agreed to observe the meeting after Sarah's careful mention of systematic civil rights violations escalating to document fraud. She sat in the back row, looking like any other concerned neighbor, while wearing a wire that would preserve every moment for federal prosecution. The beautiful irony was that Brenda had personally invited the federal prosecutor who would eventually send her to prison. At exactly 7 p.m., Brenda called the meeting to order with the inflated authority of someone who believed they'd conquered the federal government through Microsoft Word and a home printer. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, holding up copies of her forged court orders like trophies. "I'm pleased to announce that Federal District Judge Sarah Rivera has officially validated our community enforcement actions." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Even her supporters looked uncomfortable with the phrase federal validation, sensing that normal HOA business didn't usually involve federal judges. "Judge Rivera's court orders," Brenda continued, waving the fake documents with theatrical enthusiasm, "confirm that certain residents have violated federal community standards and must be removed within 72 hours to maintain neighborhood compliance." I watched Attorney Martinez discreetly taking notes as Brenda committed federal fraud in real time, claiming a federal judge's authority while that judge's prosecutor documented every word. The mini twist that guaranteed Brenda's destruction came when she decided to read directly from her forged documents. "By order of the Honorable Sarah Rivera," Brenda proclaimed with the confidence of someone announcing divine judgment, "the following families are hereby ordered to vacate their residences for persistent violations of federal housing compliance standards." She began reading names like she was announcing lottery winners. "The Rivera family, for commercial vehicle violations and aggressive behavior toward community authority." The irony of Brenda reading a fake eviction order for Judge Rivera's own family, while claiming Judge Rivera had signed it, felt like watching someone commit suicide via federal crime in slow motion. "The Lucy family, for cultural aromatic violations and foreign language disturbances." Each name she read constituted another federal crime, another year of prison time, another nail in the coffin she'd built for herself with remarkable dedication. "The Patel family, for excessive cultural displays and non-conforming residential activities." By the time she finished reading 12 names, Brenda had committed roughly 47 federal felonies in front of a federal prosecutor, local media, and enough witnesses to populate a small town. But she wasn't finished destroying herself. "I want everyone to understand," Brenda continued, her voice rising with the passion of someone who believed they were saving civilization, "that Judge Rivera personally reviewed these cases and agrees that certain types of people don't belong in quality communities like ours." The phrase "certain types of people" landed like a racial slur wrapped in federal authority. Even the local news reporter looked shocked at the blatant discrimination being claimed in a federal judge's name. Attorney Martinez was writing so fast her pen was practically smoking, but Brenda's final mistake was the most beautiful of all. In her moment of absolute triumph, she decided to share the details of her federal court research. "I want you all to know how thoroughly I prepared these cases," she announced with pride that would have been admirable if it weren't completely insane. "I researched federal court procedures, studied Judge Rivera's previous decisions, and formatted these documents to meet exact federal standards." She'd just confessed to premeditated federal fraud in front of a federal prosecutor. "Judge Rivera clearly understands the importance of maintaining community standards over disruptive elements," Brenda concluded, holding up the forged signature like she was displaying the Declaration of Independence. The meeting ended with polite applause from people who had no idea they'd just witnessed someone commit enough federal crimes to justify life imprisonment. As neighbors filed out, discussing the surreal experience in hushed tones, I noticed Attorney Martinez approaching me with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just watched a defendant build their own federal case. "Mr. Rivera," she said quietly, "I think we should schedule a meeting. Soon." Outside, the desert air felt electric with anticipation, like the moments before a monsoon storm breaks over Phoenix. Brenda had given federal prosecutors enough evidence to write legal textbooks about document fraud. Tomorrow, the rain would finally fall. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crystal-clear desert sky that makes you believe in divine justice. At 11 a.m., our doorbell rang with the precise authority of federal law enforcement. Through our security cameras, I watched 2 FBI agents and Attorney Martinez approach our front door, looking like harbingers of justice dressed in business suits. "Mr. Rivera," Agent Rodriguez said when I answered, "we're here about the forged federal court documents. We'd like to discuss next steps with you and your wife." The phrase "your wife" carried weight that suggested they knew exactly who they were dealing with. When Sarah appeared in the doorway wearing her black judicial robes, she'd just returned from morning court session, Agent Rodriguez's expression shifted to something approaching reverence. "Your Honor," he said with the respect federal agents reserve for federal judges, "we have a situation involving forged documents bearing your signature and seal." What happened next was the most beautiful choreography of federal justice I'd ever witnessed. Sarah invited them into our kitchen, where she'd arranged Brenda's forged documents like evidence in a criminal trial. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the weight of federal authority as she methodically explained each forgery to the agents who would prosecute them. "This signature," Sarah said, pointing to Brenda's pathetic attempt at copying her handwriting, "is obviously forged. My actual signature looks nothing like this amateur forgery." Agent Rodriguez photographed each document with the systematic precision of someone building a federal case. "Ma'am, we've documented 12 identical forgeries distributed throughout your neighborhood, all claiming your authority for housing discrimination." "Housing discrimination?" Sarah's judicial voice carried undertones of barely controlled fury. "Show me." As the agents explained Brenda's systematic targeting of minority families, claiming federal judicial support for ethnic cleansing, I watched my wife's expression transform from professional interest to personal outrage. "This woman forged my signature to justify racism?" Sarah asked, her voice dropping to the dangerous quiet that meant someone was about to experience the full weight of federal justice. Attorney Martinez opened her laptop, showing video evidence from Thursday's meeting. "Your Honor, we recorded her claiming you personally reviewed these cases and agreed that certain types of people don't belong in quality communities." The silence that followed could have been measured with scientific instruments. Sarah stared at the video with the focused intensity of a federal judge reviewing death penalty appeals. "She claimed I support housing discrimination?" Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the authority of someone who dedicated her career to civil rights law. "She forged my name to terrorize my own neighbors?" That's when Sarah made the decision that would define Brenda's fate. "Agent Rodriguez," she said with judicial finality, "I want this woman arrested today. Not next week, not after additional investigation. Today. She committed federal fraud against a federal judge's family while claiming that judge supports ethnic cleansing." The agents exchanged glances that suggested they'd been hoping for exactly this response. "Your Honor," Attorney Martinez said carefully, "we'd like to arrest her publicly at today's follow-up community meeting she's called to discuss federal compliance deadlines." Sarah's smile was sharp enough to cut diamond. "Make it educational." At 3 p.m., the entire neighborhood gathered in the clubhouse for what Brenda had advertised as a federal compliance celebration. She'd prepared certificates thanking families who supported her enforcement actions and deportation notices for families she'd targeted. The setup was perfect. Local media, 89 residents, and Brenda holding court like she'd conquered the federal government through determination and racism. "Ladies and gentlemen," Brenda announced with the confidence of someone who believed they'd won the lottery, "I'm pleased to announce that Judge Rivera has expedited our community improvement timeline." That's when the back doors opened and federal agents entered like the hand of justice itself. "Brenda Kessler," Agent Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying across the stunned clubhouse. "You're under arrest for federal document fraud, impersonating federal officers, and civil rights violations." The silence that followed was so complete, you could hear people's hearts stopping. Brenda's face went through an incredible transformation, from confident to confused to terrified, as she realized that her forged federal court orders were about to become real federal court cases. "There must be some mistake," she stammered, still holding her fake certificates like they could protect her from reality. "No mistake," Attorney Martinez said, approaching with handcuffs that gleamed under the clubhouse lights. "You forged a federal judge's signature 12 times, claimed federal authority for housing discrimination, and committed mail fraud against federal officials." But the moment that made this perfect justice came when Sarah entered the room, still wearing her judicial robes, looking like the embodiment of federal authority that Brenda had been impersonating. The collective gasp from 89 neighbors created a sound like wind rushing through a canyon. "Ms. Kessler," Sarah said with judicial gravity that filled every corner of the clubhouse, "you forged my signature, impersonated my court, and claimed I support the exact type of discrimination I've spent my career fighting." Brenda's legs gave out. She actually collapsed into a folding chair as the full magnitude of her mistake became clear. "You're Judge Rivera?" she whispered, her voice carrying the horror of someone realizing they'd just declared war on the federal government. "I am," Sarah replied with finality that sounded like a gavel striking. "And you're under arrest." The federal case moved through the system with the unstoppable momentum of an avalanche. Brenda Kessler pled guilty to 14 federal felony counts rather than face trial, where Attorney Martinez had promised to present enough evidence to write legal textbooks about document fraud. The courtroom was packed with our neighbors when Judge Morrison, Sarah had recused herself, sentenced Brenda to 32 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years supervised probation. The best part? Sarah testified as a victim of identity theft, explaining to a federal courtroom how Brenda had forged her signature to justify housing discrimination. Watching my wife describe the psychological impact of having her judicial authority used to terrorize her own neighbors was like witnessing poetry written in legal language. "Your Honor," Sarah had said with the quiet dignity of someone who dedicated her career to justice, "having my name and reputation used to justify racism represents an attack not just on my family but on the federal judiciary itself." Brenda was ordered to pay $127,000 in restitution, covering our legal costs, moving expenses for families who'd fled her harassment, and damages for emotional distress. The federal seizure of her assets, including her pristine white Lexus and overpriced house, barely covered half the judgment. But the legal consequences were just the beginning of Brenda's comeuppance. The story went viral within hours of her arrest. HOA president tries to evict federal judge's family using forged court orders became national news, trending on every social media platform and inspiring countless memes about suburban racism meeting federal justice. CNN interviewed Sarah about HOA abuse and federal oversight. The New York Times wrote a feature about housing discrimination in retirement communities. 60 Minutes did a segment on Brenda's case that turned her into the poster child for everything wrong with unchecked HOA authority. Her humiliation was complete, permanent, and thoroughly deserved. Meanwhile, our community transformed into something beautiful. Mrs. Lucy was elected HOA president unanimously, running on a platform of actual community building instead of racist harassment. Her first official act was establishing the Sunset Ridge Diversity Council, ensuring that all families felt welcome regardless of ethnicity, language, or cultural practices. The illegal fines were refunded with interest from Brenda's house sale. Mr. Patel organized financial literacy workshops for families who'd been scammed. The Gonzalez family started monthly cultural celebrations that filled our clubhouse with authentic food, traditional music, and the sound of children playing together. My solar business exploded with referrals from neighbors who'd watched me stand up to federal fraud. I'm now installing panels throughout Phoenix, employing 3 full-time technicians and planning expansion into renewable energy consulting. Sarah took a sabbatical to write Fighting HOA Abuse, a legal guide for homeowners, which became required reading in law schools nationwide. The book's dedication reads, "For everyone who ever faced discrimination disguised as community standards." But the most satisfying transformation was watching our neighborhood evolve from Brenda's segregated suburb into an actual community. Evening walks now smell like a United Nations food festival. Mrs. Lucy's stir-fry, the Patel's curry, Maria's tamales, and Sarah's experimental fusion cooking creating an aromatic symphony that represents everything Brenda tried to destroy. The sound of children speaking multiple languages fills our streets. Weekend block parties feature mariachi music, Bollywood dancing, and elderly neighbors teaching each other traditional recipes. The community pool, which Brenda tried to restrict to families meeting community standards, now hosts swimming lessons where kids learn to count in Spanish, Hindi, and Mandarin. We established the Brenda Kessler Memorial Scholarship for students studying civil rights law, funded by her restitution payments and named specifically to ensure her legacy serves justice instead of hatred. 2 years later, Brenda was released from federal prison to find our neighborhood completely transformed. I actually saw her drive by once in a beat-up Honda, staring at the same houses she'd tried to ethnically cleanse, now filled with families celebrating their cultures openly and proudly. My truck sits permanently in our driveway, solar panel samples gleaming in Arizona sunshine. Sarah tends her garden while wearing t-shirts that say Federal Judge in 12 different languages, gifts from grateful neighbors. Sometimes justice isn't just about punishment. It's about building something better from the ashes of hatred.